It began with a quiet stretch of countryside, 10 peaceful acres of open land resting just beyond the limits of a freshly built suburban community called Maple Ridge Estates. The land had been in Ethan's family for generations, a wide-open pasture surrounded by a sturdy wooden fence and a rusted metal gate that rarely swung open. To the residents of the newly established HOA community, it was an eyesore, a waste of potential, as they often called it during their board meetings. To Ethan, however, it was home. Every morning he'd watch the fog drift over the field, the dew glistening on tall grass, the sound of distant birds welcoming dawn. He kept to himself mostly, rarely interfering with the people who moved into the neighborhood across the fence. But in time he noticed a particular woman who made it her business to interfere with him. Her name was Karen Winslow, the self-appointed president of the Maple Ridge HOA. Her house was the largest one on the corner lot, the kind that stood out more than it belonged. She drove a spotless silver SUV and always wore oversized sunglasses, as if perpetually surveying her kingdom. Ethan had heard stories, how she fined neighbors for leaving their trash cans out too long or for having lawn ornaments that clashed with community aesthetics. But he never imagined she'd turn her attention toward him, a man who wasn't even part of her neighborhood. It started small. Letters left on his gate, neatly typed on HOA letterhead. Notice of property violation. Unkempt field concern. Unauthorized storage of equipment. Ethan ignored them. He didn't live under their rules, and he certainly didn't answer to Karen. But with every week that passed, the tone of the letters grew sharper. Karen began sending HOA representatives, clipboard-carrying volunteers, to inspect the edge of his property. They'd stand just outside his fence, whispering, pointing, taking photos of his barn, his tractor, even his old rusted water tank. It was as if his land offended them simply by existing. Ethan said nothing. He had weathered nosy neighbors before, but then, one bright morning in early spring, he noticed something strange. Signs were being placed along the HOA's main road. Maple Ridge Summer Social, Community Gathering. Saturday, 12 p.m., 6 p.m. A harmless event, he thought, until he saw where the arrow on the sign pointed, toward his gate. Confused, he followed the road until he reached the neighborhood's online forum, where residents chattered about the upcoming grand HOA summer celebration. The location? The open meadow adjacent to Maple Ridge, Karen's words. His land. At first, Ethan thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they meant the small greenbelt behind the HOA clubhouse. But as the week went on, the truth became clear. Karen was planning to host the entire neighborhood's event, food trucks, tents, live music, on his property. Without permission, she had gone so far as to tell residents that the field owner had graciously agreed to lend the space. That lie spread quickly, and excitement grew. Families planned potluck dishes, kids prepared games, and by Friday afternoon, 10 large charter buses were scheduled to arrive, each carrying HOA guests, relatives, and even vendors. Ethan's disbelief turned into a cold, simmering anger. He checked his fence, uncut, secure. He walked the boundary, noting the fresh tire tracks near his gate. Someone, probably Karen, had already driven inside once to survey the area. By evening, Ethan sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the tree line. His field stretched out before him, open, golden, and quiet. He could see the reflection of lights across the fence as HOA volunteers began setting up tents just outside, waiting for access. That night, Ethan made a plan. He would not confront them. He would not call the police, not yet. He would simply allow them in, every last one, and then he would make sure they understood that his land was not theirs to claim. The next morning, he cleaned up the gate area, removing the padlock that had kept it shut for years. He even greased the hinges so it would swing open easily. Then he parked his truck at the far edge of the field, out of sight, and waited. By noon, the rumble of engines filled the air, the first of the buses arriving, led by Karen's silver SUV. She drove proudly, a walkie-talkie in hand, leading her caravan like a parade marshal. The gate creaked open as the buses rolled in one by one. Laughter, chatter, and music spilled into the air. Families stepped out, setting up picnic blankets and speakers. Kids ran across the open grass. Karen strutted through the field, sunglasses gleaming, as if she had truly conquered new territory. Ethan watched from a distance, calm and silent. 10 buses, nearly 100 cars. A full community gathered on his land, completely unaware. And when the last vehicle rolled through, he stepped forward quietly, methodically, and closed the gate behind them. Then he locked it. The sound of the metal latch echoed through the field, swallowed by the music and laughter. Karen hadn't noticed. Not yet. But she would, and when she did, Ethan planned to make sure that this was a lesson she, and the entire HOA, would never forget. The afternoon sun blazed across the open field, turning the grass into a golden sea beneath a cloudless sky. Music thumped from rented speakers, laughter echoed, and children darted between folding tables laden with food. From a distance, it might have looked like a perfect community gathering, bright, cheerful, and carefree. But beneath that facade of festivity, a quiet tension was building, one that only Ethan was aware of. He watched from the shade of an old oak near the far fence line, leaning against his truck with arms crossed. The padlock on the gate glimmered in the sunlight, heavy, solid, and final. 10 charter buses, dozens of SUVs, and nearly 200 people were now sealed inside his property. They didn't know it yet, but they would soon. Karen Winslow stood at the center of it all, directing volunteers like a general on a parade ground. Her purple blouse shimmered, her sunglasses reflecting the open sky as she waved her arms at vendors setting up food stalls. She looked entirely at home, as though the field had always been hers. She had even put up banners, Maple Ridge HOA Summer Bash 2025, which fluttered arrogantly in the wind. Ethan almost laughed when he saw them. She hadn't even bothered to check the ownership of the land she was invading. For the first hour, Ethan did nothing. He let them spread out. Lawn chairs unfolded, coolers popped open, and portable toilets were wheeled off the buses. The field filled with the noise of careless comfort, the kind that comes from people too entitled to imagine they could ever be wrong. But when the first neighbor tried to leave, everything began to unravel. A man in a wide hat and cargo shorts walked his family back to their car, ready to head home early. He climbed in, started the engine, and rolled toward the gate. When he reached it, he stepped out to move the chain, only to find it sealed tight with a new lock. Confusion crossed his face. He tugged at it again, harder this time. The gate didn't budge. Minutes later, Karen's voice rose above the music, sharp and commanding. Several men gathered near the gate, trying to figure it out. They pulled, they rattled, they argued. The music faltered. The laughter dimmed. Slowly, the realization spread through the crowd. They were trapped. Phones came out. Calls were made. Some residents tried to contact Ethan, though few even knew his full name. Others demanded Karen handle it. After all, she was the one who had arranged everything. She assured everyone it was a misunderstanding and sent a volunteer to fetch bolt cutters. But the volunteer soon discovered that the cutters were on one of the buses, and the buses weren't moving anywhere without that gate open. Meanwhile, Ethan remained quiet. He sat on the hood of his truck, watching it unfold like a movie he'd already seen a dozen times. He could hear faint shouting from across the field, his name carried on the wind, followed by the words, private property, and call the sheriff. He wasn't angry. He was patient. Because this wasn't just about trespassing. It was about arrogance, the kind that assumed ownership simply because it was convenient. Karen, of course, refused to admit fault. Even as panic began to ripple through the crowd, she marched toward the gate with her phone pressed to her ear, demanding someone from the sheriff's office come unlock this nonsense immediately. When that didn't yield instant results, she turned her fury inward, lashing out at the residents she had lured here. Vendors complained about ruined schedules. Parents tried to calm crying children. The heat grew unbearable as the hours passed. The smell of spilled drinks and trampled grass filled the air. At around 3 p.m., Ethan finally stood up. He started his truck and slowly drove toward the gathering. The sound of his tires crunching gravel drew dozens of eyes. By the time he reached the main crowd, silence had replaced the music completely. They parted as he parked near the gate, a silent wave of uneasy faces. Karen stepped forward, her composure cracking, her sunglasses pushed up into her hair. She began gesturing wildly toward him, trying to assert control. But Ethan didn't speak. He didn't shout or argue. He simply looked around, at the torn grass, the overflowing trash bins, the children sweating in the sun, and then at the padlocked gate behind her. When he finally did move, it was to lift a small sign he had placed earlier near the fence line. It read, in bold letters, "Private property. Trespassers will be charged for damages." The crowd went still. The reality settled in. They hadn't just been locked in, they had been caught. Phones came out again, but this time, they weren't filming for fun. They were recording for defense. People began to turn on Karen, accusing her of lying, of misleading them into thinking the field was public. She tried to argue that Ethan had verbally agreed weeks ago, though she couldn't name a date or time. Ethan didn't correct her. He didn't need to. The lies were already unraveling. By 5 p.m., the sheriff's deputies finally arrived, 2 patrol cars pulling up outside the gate. The officers inspected the lock, spoke to Karen through the bars, and then walked away to make a phone call. When they returned, their expressions had changed. They approached Ethan, who waited quietly by his truck, and confirmed what he already knew. The property was his. The deed was clear. The officers advised Karen and the HOA to vacate immediately. But since the gate was locked from the inside, they would need Ethan's cooperation. The crowd turned to him, desperate for mercy. For a long, deliberate moment, he said nothing. The air hung heavy with tension. Then, without a word, he stepped forward, unlatched the lock, and swung the gate open. The crowd flooded out, hurried, embarrassed, and silent. Buses rumbled to life. Cars kicked up dust as they sped toward the neighborhood. Karen was the last to leave, her SUV crawling past him, her expression twisted between anger and humiliation. When the final vehicle disappeared down the road, Ethan closed the gate once more. The field was a mess. Tire ruts, garbage, and broken grass everywhere. But he didn't mind, because now he had proof. And this was far from over. By dawn the next morning, the field was quiet again, eerily so. The laughter, the shouting, the chaos of the day before had evaporated, leaving behind only the evidence of what had happened. Deep tire tracks carved through the dirt. Shredded banners fluttered weakly from broken stakes. Paper plates, soda cans, and plastic utensils littered the grass like confetti from a battle already lost. Ethan stood at the edge of it all, coffee in hand, surveying the aftermath. To anyone else, it might have looked like a disaster. But to him, it was documentation, physical proof of an intrusion. He took photos of everything, the mess, the bus's tire marks, even a forgotten table with the HOA's logo still taped to it. Each photo was time-stamped, clear, and irrefutable. He knew Karen wouldn't let this go quietly. Someone like her, prideful, power-hungry, obsessed with image, wouldn't accept public humiliation without trying to strike back. The only question was how. He didn't have to wait long for the answer. By noon, his phone buzzed with a call from the county zoning office. A formal complaint had been filed against him. Multiple. Actually, citing unlicensed event hosting, public endangerment, and unauthorized use of agricultural property for commercial activity. Ethan almost laughed out loud. She was trying to turn the tables. Karen had reported him for the very party she had organized on his land. The zoning official, doing his job, scheduled a site inspection. Ethan didn't argue. He told them to come by any time and hung up. Then he printed out the photos he'd taken, along with a copy of the sheriff's report confirming that the HOA had trespassed. He placed everything neatly in a folder labeled simply, Maple Ridge Incident. 2 days later, a white county SUV pulled up to his gate. The inspector was polite. cautious even, as he stepped out and explained the nature of the complaints. Ethan handed over the folder, calm and composed. The man flipped through the papers, his brow tightening with each page. By the time he reached the sheriff's statement, his tone changed completely. "Looks like someone's wasting our time," he muttered, before heading back to his vehicle. An hour later, Ethan watched as the county SUV drove straight past his gate and turned into Maple Ridge Estates. He didn't need to guess where it was going. That afternoon, Karen received a very different kind of visit. Residents later recalled seeing two officials walking up her driveway, clipboards in hand. For once, Karen's confident stride faltered. Voices rose. Neighbors peered through blinds. And by sunset, the HOA's social media page went quiet. All event photos deleted, all posts locked to members only, but the damage had already spread. Word of what happened traveled fast. Parents were furious that their children had been taken to private property without permission. Vendors demanded refunds. Several HOA members resigned from the planning committee altogether. Ethan thought that might be the end of it. But Karen wasn't done. Within a week, new letters began appearing in his mailbox. This time, they weren't typed on HOA letterhead. They were anonymous, handwritten, bitter, and full of accusations. "You're the reason our community is falling apart. You embarrass decent people for no reason. You'll pay for this." He ignored them at first, but soon the petty tactics escalated. One morning, he found that his mailbox had been knocked over. Another day, someone dumped a bag of trash near his gate. At night, he'd hear engines idling on the road, cars slowing down just long enough to toss something into his field before speeding off. He installed cameras along the fence line. The footage confirmed what he suspected: Karen's SUV. Again and again, caught creeping by after dark. Ethan knew that direct confrontation would only feed her obsession. So he decided on something different, something that would hurt her pride more than any argument ever could. He filed a civil trespassing claim against the Maple Ridge HOA, naming Karen Winslow personally as the responsible party. He attached every photo, every video, every sheriff's report. The claim wasn't just about damages, it was about accountability. Weeks passed before she received the notice. When she did, the reaction was immediate. HOA members stormed into emergency meetings. Neighbors started whispering again. Some sided with Karen, others didn't. But her once tight control over the community began to crumble. Meanwhile, Ethan remained quiet, letting the legal process unfold. He had no interest in revenge, not in the usual sense. What he wanted was justice, and perhaps a little poetic irony. So, when the HOA board offered to settle privately, Ethan agreed to meet, but on his terms. He invited them to his property, the very place that had started all of this. Karen arrived flanked by two board members, her sunglasses hiding what little dignity she had left. Ethan led them through the field, pointing out the still visible damage. The crushed soil, the burned patches from cooking equipment, the broken fence post. He didn't raise his voice or demand anything unreasonable. He simply stated the cost of restoration and handed them the invoice. The board members looked uneasy. Karen's jaw clenched. The total wasn't outrageous, but just enough to sting. When they hesitated, Ethan mentioned that he'd already filed everything with the county court. That was the moment she broke. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, turned shrill. She accused him of harassment, of targeting her personally. But the board members didn't back her up this time. They'd had enough of her antics, too. By the end of that meeting, Ethan walked away with a signed agreement. The HOA would cover the full damages and issue a written apology for the trespassing. It should have ended there. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully, and when she realized that her name, Karen Winslow, had become the talk of every HOA gossip group in 3 neighboring counties, she decided to strike back one final time. Her next move wouldn't just threaten Ethan's property, it would threaten his livelihood. Summer crept deeper into the season, bringing long days, heavy heat, and the uneasy calm that follows a storm not yet finished. Ethan's field had started to recover. The grass, though scarred by tire tracks, had begun to regrow. The air smelled of hay and fresh soil again. From a distance, you might never guess the chaos that had unfolded there weeks earlier. But underneath that surface calm, something was shifting. Karen Winslow had gone quiet. Too quiet. The HOA's usual announcements stopped appearing online. Her silver SUV was rarely seen during the day, though neighbors whispered that lights still burned in her office window late into the night. She wasn't retreating. She was planning. Ethan knew her type well by now, people who thrived on control and attention. When that control slipped away, they didn't fade out. They regrouped. And when Karen regrouped, it was always with venom. He didn't have to wait long to see what form it would take. One humid Tuesday morning, Ethan received a thick envelope from the County Development Office. Inside was a formal notice of eminent domain review. The HOA had submitted a petition suggesting that his property be annexed into Maple Ridge Estates as a community green space, citing its neglected and unsafe condition. They wanted his land, and legally this time. Karen had somehow convinced a few remaining loyalists on the HOA board to push for county review, disguising her vendetta as a beautification project. Her proposal included building a public walking path and family recreation area. On paper, it looked like civic progress. In reality, it was a veiled land grab. Ethan read every line carefully. The audacity would have been laughable if it weren't so calculated. Karen was trying to bury her humiliation under paperwork, to force him to surrender what she couldn't take by deceit. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. The odds of the county approving an HOA annexation of private farmland were slim, but he knew how persistent bureaucracy could be, and how manipulative Karen was when she wanted something. He couldn't risk assuming this would simply die out, so he started preparing. He compiled every document he had from the previous incident: photos, sheriff's reports, invoices, and the signed apology. He added the new petition, printed emails, and copies of HOA minutes he'd obtained through a neighbor sympathetic to his side. He built a case not just of ownership, but of harassment. At the same time, he noticed small things changing around his property. County inspectors began showing up again, not for the annexation, but for routine checks. A complaint about hazardous storage one week, soil contamination the next. Each time they found nothing, and each time the source of the complaint was anonymous. But Ethan didn't need to guess. Karen had weaponized the system. He stayed patient, polite and methodical, documenting every visit, every letter, every failed inspection. He started to see her pattern, a woman unraveling, desperate to regain the power she had once held so tightly. Meanwhile, inside Maple Ridge, the mood was souring. The HOA members who had stood by her were growing weary. Her constant vendettas were costing them money: legal fees, meeting hours, and public embarrassment. Parents didn't want to attend meetings anymore. Vendors refused contracts. Even her once loyal board treasurer had quietly resigned, leaving her to handle the mounting backlash alone. But Karen clung to her obsession with Ethan's land. It wasn't about property anymore. It was about pride. When the date for the county review hearing arrived, Ethan drove into town with his folder under his arm. The meeting was held in a plain building with fluorescent lights and rows of metal chairs. The kind of place where local politics simmered quietly behind polite smiles. Karen was already there, dressed in her usual expensive blazer, posture rigid, flanked by two HOA representatives who looked more nervous than confident. She glanced at Ethan when he entered, her expression a mixture of forced calm and buried fury. The county officials began by reading her petition. Karen spoke with rehearsed charm, describing her vision for a shared community park, emphasizing safety, accessibility, and beauty for all. She painted a picture of civic generosity, as though she were offering salvation to a neglected corner of land. Then Ethan was invited to speak. He didn't match her theatrics. He didn't need to. He opened his folder and laid out one by one the facts: the unauthorized event, the trespassing, the official reports, the cleanup costs the HOA had been forced to pay, the harassment through anonymous complaints. And finally, the ongoing attempts to use policy as a tool for revenge. He spoke slowly, clearly letting the documentation do the talking. By the time he finished, the room was silent except for the rustle of paper. Even the county commissioners looked uncomfortable. One of them asked Karen to confirm that the HOA had indeed hosted an unpermitted event on his land. She hesitated, then stammered out a defensive half-answer about miscommunication. That was enough. Within minutes, the panel unanimously voted to reject the petition. Ethan's property would remain private, and the HOA was issued a formal warning for misuse of county resources. Karen sat frozen in her seat, her composure cracking visibly. For the first time, Ethan saw something in her eyes that wasn't arrogance or anger. It was disbelief. The kind that comes when a person realizes they've lost everything they thought they controlled. When the hearing adjourned, she rose without a word and stormed out, her heels clacking sharply against the tile floor. Her two companions followed in awkward silence. Ethan lingered behind, shaking hands with the officials, thanking them for their time. When he finally stepped outside, the afternoon sunlight felt different, warmer, freer, final. He thought that was the end, but that night, long after the sun went down, Ethan heard the sound of an engine in the distance, slow, familiar. Headlights briefly flashed through the trees before cutting out. Then, nothing. The next morning, he found his gate standing wide open. The lock was gone. The chain lay twisted in the dirt. Karen wasn't finished after all. The morning after the hearing broke with an eerie stillness. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of dew and soil. Birds called softly from the fence posts, unaware that something had shifted in the night. Ethan stood at the entrance to his property, staring at what remained of his gate. The padlock was gone, the chain warped and broken. Deep tire tracks cut into the dirt, not just one set, but several, weaving through the grass in erratic loops. She had come back. The marks told the story clearly enough. At least 2 vehicles had entered sometime after midnight. They'd driven recklessly through the field, circling the barn, flattening what grass had managed to regrow. Near the center of the pasture, a charred patch of earth marked where something had burned. A pile of paper, perhaps, or the remnants of a petty fire. Ethan walked closer, crouching beside the ashes. Among the half-burned scraps, he found the corner of a familiar purple flyer, the same ones from the HOA's ill-fated Summer Bash. Only this time the ink was smeared, the slogan barely visible, Maple Ridge HOA Summer Celebration. He exhaled slowly. It wasn't vandalism. It was a message. Karen Winslow had lost her influence, her credibility, and her reputation. Now she was turning to desperation. The county ruling had humiliated her publicly, her project exposed as a personal vendetta. Her board had begun distancing themselves. Even her friends had gone quiet. For a woman who built her entire existence on power, that kind of isolation was unbearable. And now she was lashing out in the only way left to her. Ethan called the sheriff's office again. The deputy who arrived was the same one from the day of the party. His expression was tired but sympathetic as he took photos of the damage. It wasn't the first vandalism report they'd received from the Maple Ridge area lately. The deputy promised to review the security footage. Ethan nodded and handed him a USB drive, the recordings from his cameras. He had installed several after Karen's previous antics. And as they loaded the video, both men saw what Ethan had already suspected. At 2:47 a.m., a silver SUV appeared at the edge of the property. Headlights dimmed, it rolled up to the gate. Minutes later, 2 figures stepped out. One wore a long coat, the other a hoodie. They used bolt cutters on the chain, then drove in. The cameras caught partial glimpses of faces, not clear enough for certain identification, but enough to make the truth obvious. The SUV was unmistakably Karen's. The deputy frowned and promised to handle it formally, but Ethan could see the hesitation behind his eyes. People like Karen had a way of muddying even the simplest cases, filing counter-complaints, stalling procedures, exhausting patience. Still, he filed the report. He wasn't about to let this go undocumented. That evening, Ethan repaired the gate again. He replaced the lock with a thicker one, installed floodlights, and added another camera near the entrance. The process was mechanical, methodical, not driven by anger, but by resolve. As dusk settled, the lights flickered on, bathing the fence line in pale security glow. The field was calm once more. But in the quiet, he could feel it, the tension lingering like the last echo of a thunderstorm. Over the next few days, the neighborhood gossip mill churned to life. Word spread about the vandalism, about the sheriff's visit, about Karen's involvement. This time, she couldn't hide behind HOA letterhead or board meetings. Her neighbors were done defending her. Some even reached out to Ethan directly, timid voices leaving voicemails of apology. They admitted they had followed her too blindly, too long. They'd believed her version of events, that Ethan was some angry recluse trying to sabotage their community. But now, the truth was clear. Still, Karen didn't stop. If she couldn't control the HOA or take his land, she would poison his name. A week later, Ethan began receiving calls from contractors, confused voices asking about the construction job on Maple Ridge land. He told them there was no project, but they insisted they had received signed requests, complete with his name and supposed authorization. She was forging documents now. Ethan forwarded everything to his attorney, who filed for a restraining order and added new charges to the ongoing civil claim. For the first time, Karen was facing the full weight of her actions, not just community gossip or embarrassment, but genuine legal consequences. When the papers were served, the HOA was already in chaos. Several homes had for sale signs in their yards. The community message board was filled with angry threads demanding Karen's resignation. But she refused to step down, insisting she was the victim of harassment and slander. Meanwhile, Ethan remained steady. He fixed his fences, worked his land, and let her unravel herself piece by piece. He didn't need revenge anymore. The truth was doing that for him. Then, one night, just as he was beginning to believe the chaos might finally die down, he noticed something unusual on his cameras. The timestamp read 11:38 p.m. A lone figure was walking up the dirt road toward the gate. Not a car this time, just footsteps. The person moved slowly, almost unsteadily, like someone carrying a heavy weight. The figure stopped at the gate, resting their hands on the bars, staring into the field for nearly 5 full minutes. Then quietly, they left. Ethan replayed the footage over and over. It wasn't clear enough to identify, but something about the silhouette, the posture. It was unmistakable. Karen Winslow. The next morning, he found a single envelope hanging from the gate latch. No name, no return address. Inside was a short handwritten note, shaky and uneven. "You took everything from me. I hope this land was worth it. It wasn't a threat." It was surrender. But something about it felt final. And in the days that followed, Maple Ridge would discover that it was. 3 days passed before anyone saw Karen Winslow again. By then, Maple Ridge Estates had fallen into uneasy silence, the kind that settles over a neighborhood after too many scandals, too many whispers. The HOA meetings were canceled indefinitely. The community board was offline. Residents kept their curtains drawn, avoiding the tension that seemed to hang in the air like a low fog. Ethan spent those days quietly. He repaired the last bit of fencing near the west corner of his field, patched the ruts where the SUVs had torn through the soil, and hauled away the last remnants of the burned debris. The land was healing, and so was he. Each day felt a little more normal, a little more his again. But even as he worked, that final note, the one left hanging from his gate, weighed on his mind. "You took everything from me. I hope this land was worth it." It wasn't just bitterness in those words. It was exhaustion. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the maples that framed the ridge, a county sheriff's vehicle turned up his driveway again. This time, there was no tension in the air, no accusations waiting at the gate. The deputy stepped out, hat in hand, and his face was heavy with the kind of sympathy that precedes bad news. Karen Winslow had been found early that morning. Her silver SUV was parked beside a small retention pond behind the HOA clubhouse, the same place where she had once held board meetings, handed out fines, and dictated neighborhood order. She hadn't been hurt, not physically, but she had left town quietly, leaving behind her home, her position, and an HOA in disarray. Her house was up for immediate sale. The deputy said she'd filed for bankruptcy. Between the legal fees, settlements, and the collapse of her reputation, she had lost nearly everything. Ethan listened in silence, nodding slowly. There was no satisfaction in hearing it, only an odd, distant kind of relief. Not for her downfall, but for the end of the chaos she had dragged everyone into. When the deputy left, Ethan walked the perimeter of his land again. The fence stood firm, the grass swayed gently in the wind, and the hum of cicadas filled the air. The field was quiet, truly quiet, for the first time in months. That evening, he sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea and watched the lights from Maple Ridge flicker in the distance. Without Karen's rule, the neighborhood had begun to change. The new acting HOA president, a soft-spoken man named Greg, had sent Ethan a handwritten letter of apology on behalf of the community. He'd included a check to cover additional repairs, though Ethan never cashed it. He didn't need their money. What mattered was the acknowledgement, the understanding that respect couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. As the weeks passed, Maple Ridge grew quieter. Families began to talk again, but their conversations were gentler now. The once feared HOA that Karen had ruled with an iron will was now a humbled, almost cooperative group. Neighbors mowed each other's lawns, waved from their driveways, and occasionally sent baked goods across the fence line, a peace offering of sorts. Ethan didn't attend their gatherings, but he didn't mind them anymore. The hostility had drained out of the air, and the field, his field, remained his. But one late summer evening, as the light turned orange across the horizon, he found something unexpected near the barn. Tucked beneath the bottom rung of the fence was another envelope. It wasn't new. The paper was weathered, its edges curled from moisture. No name, no stamp, no address. Inside was a folded piece of stationery, elegant, expensive, embossed with the faint outline of the Maple Ridge HOA logo. The handwriting was the same as the first note, sharp but trembling. You were right. It was never about the land. It was about being seen. I thought running everything meant I mattered, but all I did was make enemies. I don't expect forgiveness. Just keep your land safe. You're the only one who truly cared about it. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. Ethan stood there for a long time, the letter fluttering slightly in the breeze. For the first time, he didn't feel anger when he thought of her, only a faint, sad understanding. People like Karen weren't born cruel. They were made that way by fear, by pride, by the desperate need to control what they couldn't understand. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the same folder that held all the old documents, the photos, the reports, the invoices, the history of the storm they had both weathered. Then he tucked it away in his desk, where it would stay, not as a trophy, as a reminder. By autumn, the land had returned to its former peace. The wildflowers bloomed again along the fence, and the grass grew high enough to ripple like waves under the wind. The scars left by the party and the vandalism faded, swallowed by time and resilience. Sometimes Ethan would still see a silver SUV on the highway, never hers, but enough to make him pause for a moment. Then he'd smile faintly and keep driving. The land remained his, unbroken, quiet, enduring. And in that silence, he finally understood the simplest truth of all. Control fades. Ownership endures. The land doesn't forget, but it forgives in its own way, just as he had. And that was the end of Karen's grand HOA party. What started as arrogance and entitlement ended with silence and a letter. One last attempt to make peace with what she'd destroyed. In the end, the land she tried to claim taught everyone in Maple Ridge a lesson they'd never forget. You can't control what was never yours to begin with. Ethan didn't need revenge. He didn't need to humiliate her. All he had to do was let her own actions speak, and they did, louder than any argument ever could. The HOA learned humility. The town learned respect, and Ethan, he got his peace back. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the law or from vengeance. It comes from patience and a locked gate. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more tales of HOA chaos, Karen meltdowns, and satisfying justice. Because here on this channel, one thing's for sure, karma always finds its way to the cul-de-sac. See you in the next story.